In the 1970s, a British-born architect named Laurie Baker was building homes across the Indian state of Kerala, and he kept doing something that looked completely wrong. Before the concrete for a roof slab was poured, he had workers lay rows of ordinary clay pots upside down inside the wooden formwork. Cheap pots, the kind sold by the thousand in any village market. The results were not subtle. It cut the concrete needed by up to 30%. It cut the steel reinforcement by up to 40%. And it dropped indoor temperatures under that roof by up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. 5 decades later, you would be hard-pressed to find a single building in the West using this technique. And once you understand why, you'll also understand exactly who it's actually useful to. Walk through any fast-growing city in the developing world, and you'll see the same flat concrete roof on building after building. Cheap, quick to pour, and structurally simple. But a solid slab of concrete has a problem most people never think about. Concrete is dense, and dense materials conduct heat well. In direct sun, a concrete roof becomes a heat battery you never asked for. It soaks up energy all day, and by mid-afternoon, the underside of that slab has warmed all the way through and started radiating heat down into the rooms below, the same sensation as standing near a wood stove. It doesn't stop at sunset either. The slab holds so much stored heat that it keeps radiating into the house for hours after dark, right when the outside air has finally cooled enough to open a window. In a typical low-rise building, that one roof surface can account for close to half of all the heat entering the structure, bearable in a cold climate. In a place where the mercury regularly passes 120 degrees, it's a real health risk. That heat problem was one of many Laurie Baker set out to solve. Baker moved to India after the Second World War and spent his career building with cheap, local, low-energy materials instead of the imported, resource-heavy style of Western architecture. He worked mostly in brick, and he's still remembered today as one of the most influential architects to work in post-war India. One of the techniques he developed was the filler slab. Take the structurally useless concrete sitting in the bottom of a roof slab and replace it with cheap, locally available material. Broken roof tiles, coconut shells, ordinary clay pots. In 1970, he used it across the Center for Development Studies campus in Trivandrum, 9 acres of buildings, cutting the cement and steel the project needed by roughly 30%. A generation later, the architect Anupama Kundu pushed the idea further, setting terracotta tubes into the ceiling of her wall house at Oroville to fight tropical heat and humidity. The design got enough attention that a full-size section of it was rebuilt for the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2012. The idea itself is much older than either of them. Roman engineers built hollow, tapered clay tubes that socketed into each other to form self-supporting vaults over public baths nearly 2,000 years ago, avoiding the enormous dead weight of a solid roof. You can still find the remains of that technique in ruins from North Africa to Roman Britain. Understanding why clay pots cut weight, cut material, and hold back heat all at once comes down to understanding what a concrete slab is actually doing structurally. When a flat slab spans a room, it sags slightly under its own weight. The top half compresses, the bottom half stretches. Because of that stretching force, every reinforced slab runs steel bars along the bottom to carry the load. The concrete packed in around those bars down there adds weight, but it adds almost no strength. It's just ballast. The filler slab technique pulls that ballast out and drops a hollow void into the gap instead. Lay the steel grid, set rows of empty pots upside down between the bars, and pour the concrete around them. Once it cures, the concrete only fills the narrow ribs between the pots, and those ribs do all the real structural work. The pots just sit there as sealed voids, exactly where the dead weight used to be. Here's the second half of the trick. Every one of those buried pots is now a sealed pocket of trapped air, and trapped air is one of the best insulators there is. It's the same principle as the gap in a double-pane window, or the airspace inside a thermos. Still air barely conducts heat, so when the sun bears down and heat tries to travel through the roof, instead of a clean path through solid mass, it keeps hitting these dead air pockets and stalling out. That mechanism shows up clearly in controlled testing. Researchers building two identical test rooms side by side, one with a standard concrete roof and one with a clay pot filler slab. Logged temperatures through the hottest part of the day. The clay pot ceiling ran roughly 13 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit cooler at the surface than the plain concrete one, and the air in the room below sat somewhere around 4 to 11 degrees under the outdoor temperature, with no air conditioning doing any of the work. There's a second effect worth knowing about, called thermal lag. A solid concrete roof pushes its peak heat into the room within about 2 hours of peak sun. The clay pot roof holds that peak back by 5 to 6 hours, shifting it into the evening, when it's finally easy to vent the heat back out through open windows. Add it up, and the modeling suggests a 25 to 30% cut in the energy needed to cool a space to the same comfort level. For a typical home in a hot U.S. region, where a summer electricity bill can run a few $100s a month, that's real money staying in your pocket every year. And that's before counting the upfront savings, since pulling out the dead concrete means 20 to 30% less concrete and 20 to 40% less structural steel, along with a lighter slab and a smaller carbon footprint for the structure overall. So if it's cheaper, cooler, and centuries old in one form or another, why can't you find a single one of these roofs in an American subdivision? The first reason is labor. In India, the filler slab is affordable, partly because so much of the work is done by hand, and skilled labor is comparatively cheap. Village potters mass-produce identical clay pots by the thousand. Move that same technique to the United States, where skilled construction labor is one of the highest costs on any job site, and the math changes fast. Every pot has to be soaked, placed, and wired into the steel grid by hand, and the concrete has to be worked in by hand instead of poured and machine vibrated like a normal slab. That labor eats through the savings you made on concrete and steel. The second reason is that there's no supply chain for it here. The village potter, who keeps Kerala stocked with cheap terracotta, simply doesn't exist in American construction. You would be importing the pots or commissioning a potter to make them, which erases most of the cost advantage before you've poured a single yard of concrete. The third reason is the building code. American structural concrete runs on the code and the concrete design standard known as ACI 318, and neither one lists the clay pot filler slab. No pre-approved load tables, no fire rating, nothing a building department can simply stamp and approve. To get it approved at all, an engineer has to file it under the code's alternative materials clause, paying for a computer modeling, physical load testing on mock-up slabs, and an independent third-party review. That's expensive enough that most developers never bother trying. And the last barrier is the plainest one. Porous clay drinks up water, and in any climate that freezes, even part of the year, that absorbed water expands into ice and cracks the pots. A clay pot roof in a freeze-thaw climate is a slow structural failure waiting to happen. This only really works as a hot climate technique, full stop. Put those four barriers together, and this becomes a technique for a genuinely small group of people. You'd need to be building new, not retrofitting an existing roof, since this only works poured fresh onto formwork before the concrete sets. You'd need a licensed structural engineer and a concrete contractor willing to sign off on it. since a roof slab is a structural element holding real weight over people's heads. There's no safe weekend version of that, and you'd need to be in a climate that genuinely never freezes. In the United States, that means the deep Gulf Coast, southern Texas, southern Arizona, and South Florida. Realistically, a narrow band of the country, not a nationwide fix. If all of that lines up, there are a few details that make or break the roof. The pots have to be soaked before the pour, or the dry clay pulls water straight out of the fresh concrete and leaves it weak. The concrete has to be worked in by hand because a power vibrator will shatter the pots or float them out of position. And you need at least an inch of solid concrete cover between every steel bar and every pot, because steel touching damp clay rusts, and rusting steel swells and cracks the slab from the inside out. If you already own a home with a flat roof in a hot, frost-free climate and you're not pouring new construction, the same physics still applies to a ventilated air gap built over your existing roof deck. It's a different install, but it's the same trapped air principle working for you instead of against you. What started as a way to cut material costs with whatever was locally abundant has quietly become one of the most effective passive cooling systems in modern architecture. It's not the right answer for every home, but for the hot, sun-battered places, it actually suits. It's a roof that's cheaper to build, lighter to carry, and cooler to live under, without drawing a single watt. So here's what I want to know. If you're building new in a hot, frost-free part of the country, would you actually take this to your engineer and ask if they'd sign off on it? Tell me where you're building and what climate you're dealing with. I want to know how many of you are actually in the narrow band of the map where this makes sense.